Right, in fact, now that we should get underway, I'll just lose that screen for 1 minute and pop up the PowerPoint again just in a moment. But it's always nice, I think, to say hello face to face, as it were, in this environment before we get underway. My name is Tim Jones. I'm a tutor with the Learning Institute, and in my kind of other professional context, I'm an educational psychologist, and it's really that background, that perspective that I'm coming at from today in order to talk about understanding our personal values and the values of others in a professional context. Also alongside me this afternoon is Andy, so I'll let him introduce himself.
Yeah, good morning. Good morning. It's good afternoon, everybody. It's Andy Filkins. I'm a police officer with the Devon Cornwall Police Force. My day job is what we call a youth and missing officer. So predominantly all my work is around young people, whether that be missing people, education, social care. So we're quite a vast remit that me and my other three colleagues in Cornwall cover.
Thank you very much. The structure for this workshop will be very similar to the one you've hopefully just been a part of, in that the first half to 3/4 at least will be looking at a presentation, some materials that I've got to share with you today, hopefully introducing a bit of new information to you, a different way of looking at personal values, and then that should seamlessly go into a bit of a discussion / question and answer towards the end, and we'll see how that gets on. Having said that, I've got my chat panel open on Teams while I talk, so please do drop in questions as we go through. Equally, I've tried to not be too intently psychological in my explanations in the slides. I've tried not to be too jargontastic, as Andy has coined a phrase. And so if it should be followable, given that there's a whole range of different roles and experiences I know attending this workshop this afternoon. But if there's anything you don't understand at any point or want me to go into more depth about, then please just stop, use the chat, put your electronic hand up, and we'll come and explore that in more detail. Let me reload that presentation, hopefully get that back up for you all on screen. There we are. What you need for today's session in order to make it a fully experiential workshop and not just a total information give from me, there's a bit of an activity towards the end of this presentation segment. So when you get there, it doesn't matter if you don't have them now, but if you are able to get these to hand over the next 10 minutes or so, they'll be useful. A blank piece of paper, or at least some piece of paper to draw on, then something to draw and to write with, pen, pencil, felt tip, whatever's to hand. And then in order to take part in the feedback part of that, you'll need something connected to the internet. If you are able to open up a new tab in the browser that you're currently using or whatever, then that's perfect. But some people find it easier to use their smartphone. And don't worry about the sticky back plastic. That's just letting me realise my childhood ambition of being a Blueprint presenter and saying things like that. So you're fine if you've got a piece of paper and something to draw with. But before we get to that stage, that's towards the end when we get on to recognising, reflecting on our personal values. Before that, we need to think about what we mean by personal values. Looking then at something called constructs, and another way that I'm hoping to introduce to you this afternoon to think about values. And in doing so, that's the bit of psychology I'm hoping to give away this afternoon. Some of you might well be familiar with that already, and that will then allow us to think about the impact of the values, the constructs that we hold, and reflect a bit on what that means, not just for ourselves, but around the activity. Also think about how we might go about eliciting the values of others and recognizing the values that other people hold in a professional context. And that, I'm sure, will give us food for thought for the discussion towards the end. What do we mean by personal values? The Oxford English Dictionary gives us a great starting point. Principles or standards of behaviour, one's judgment of what is important in life. And it's that latter half of the phrase that particularly chimes with me when I'm thinking about personal values. What you hold as important in your life, and therefore make judgments about other people and other organizations, services, is going to be different from the other people who are part of this workshop, the other people who are part of this conference. Everybody holds different values about what's important. Whilst there are always going to be some overlaps and some similarities, they are personal to us. They might not be things that we could consciously bring to mind. Some of them are, and we're very happy to talk about our values, but others might just sit in the background and impact upon our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors without us ever really realizing that that's what they're doing. And part of having a session like this is just to begin the conversation that the more we're aware of our personal values and how that impacts upon our behavior, the more we are, I guess, in control of that action, and therefore whether we want to follow through with that, or whether that's something we choose to inhibit at a particular point, or even do we look at changing our personal values, which is a big ask, but might be right if we feel that it's at odds with whatever the situation is presenting. So generally speaking, raising awareness of personal values has got to be a helpful thing for both our personal and our professional lives. A little bit there that says about life satisfaction, relying strongly on our personal values and linking closely with our personal values. So we know from research, for instance, that if somebody's personal value that they hold is neatly aligned, is well matched with the situation in which they find themselves, people generally report themselves to be happier, more satisfied with life. But conversely, if the values that you hold dear to you are then mismatched with your current situation, that's when people report very low levels of life satisfaction. And so as a quick example, you might have two people both in a stressful situation with work. They have long hours in their job and loads of things to do. They're working kind of all hours that God sends, and weekends as well. And if one of those workers has a value around the importance of contact with friends and family and spending time with those individuals, then they are likely to report very low life satisfaction and be very unhappy, because that very time-consuming job is preventing them from realizing one of their values. On the other side of the desk, potentially, is somebody who's in the same job, pulling the same hours, but whose values are around career progression and ambition and being seen as hardworking by other people, in which case their very stressful and hardworking job is likely to be helping them realize their values, and as a result they will be much happier. And so this is what's so brilliant about values and thinking about them, and then I get excited because it's about psychology in general, that we're looking at two people in an identical situation and they're reacting in different ways, and that if we can understand better why people react differently to the same situation, then that allows us to make positive change in the world. And that's why I seek to do, and colleagues seek to do what we do with psychology, and why I think it's important to share with you this afternoon. I do just want to mention one thing about unconscious bias. There's not a really easy way for me to delineate unconscious biases from values. That is very much an overlapping concept. I guess the easiest way is to think about values as being very generally moral based, and things that, if they're either conscious or if we're not aware of our values, if they were brought to the fore, we would recognize them as things that are important to us and we would subscribe to those. Whereas biases, although they impact on our behavior and our thoughts and our feelings in the same way, in the context of these unconscious biases that you might have heard being talked about in media in recent months, we generally wouldn't subscribe to what we wouldn't necessarily recognize those biases, and certainly wouldn't see them as being things that are important to us. And so it's an overlapping topic, but one that is a bit different. And today I'm very much talking about personal values, but it would have been remiss of me, I think, not to mention unconscious bias. So unconscious bias, sometimes called implicit bias, are those deep-seated prejudices that we get because of exposure to so much experience and development and culture and society in life. And they tell us in terms of into our subconscious what we should expect from society and those around us. And so we might have very gendered ideas of roles, professional roles, for instance, about who should be a doctor and who should be a nurse, should it be a man or a woman, who should be a firefighter, who should be a police officer. You see, I almost got myself saying policeman there, and that says it all about these unconscious biases. They just come in sometimes into our lexicon, into our vocabulary, and that's what causes a difficulty. One of the real problems with these unconscious biases is they perpetuate the inequality that has led us to hold those biases in the first place. So if we're in a recruitment situation, as a bit of a crude example, and it's for a job that I hold a particular view about, that it's best suited to a woman, and there's a woman and a man as candidates at interview, then all my unconscious biases is telling me to hire the woman for that role. And obviously lots of situations vice versa to that. And that's why raising awareness of these unconscious biases, bringing them to the fore, can help us to challenge them, challenge the negative predispositions that it leads to, and hopefully change our behaviour. Because of that, lots of organisations, lots of companies are doing unconscious bias training at the moment. Generally, that's got to be a good thing. We want more people to be aware of these. But I should nod towards the recent controversy around them. Some places, the UK civil service, for instance, most notably, dropping unconscious bias training. That's less to do with the fact that it's a bad idea, because I think most people would agree it's a good idea. But it's the fact that it can, if we're not careful, become a bit of a tick box exercise, in that the civil service run a half-hour unconscious bias training and suddenly everything's okay and there's not going to be any more bias anymore, no more systemic racism or anything like that. Whereas patently we know that raising awareness is an important step, but it's only the first step, and we need longer-term action in order to lead to behavioural change. So I'll just mention that. Anyway, this afternoon, if I'm not moving too swiftly, but I know time is always a bit tight, we're thinking about personal values, something that those kind of moral judgments about what's important to us that we would recognise as opposed to those biases. And a hopeful, helpful way of thinking about personal values is to introduce personal constructs and something called personal construct psychology to you this afternoon. This is a movement, like a lot of approaches and theories in psychology and in science in general. It's a reaction to what had gone before. And a psychologist, American psychologist called George Kelly, back in the 50s, felt quite dissatisfied with the very passive role that humans were seen to play when being judged through a behaviorist lens or psychodynamic lens. That's some of that jargon I was warning you about. But if you're not familiar with those positions, they're essentially very contrasting ways of thinking about human behavior and why humans behave in the way they do, but they're similar in the sense that they view humans as being almost at the whim of the environment and of various innate drives for us and our motivations. Whereas Kelly felt there was much more of an active role for humans. We're not these passive receptacles that just experience the world. Instead, our views of the world, our interpretations of them, of the world and situations we encounter, construct and shape our understanding, and that in turn affects our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors. And that's what's so brilliant about his theory. It's really recognizing that we have an active role in constructing the world around us, which also means, very positively, we can reconstruct the world if there's a way in which we're not doing something positively, or we can support others to reconstruct their world if their current values, if their current constructions are problematic. Kelly called the values constructs, and that's what he said guides the way for interpreting and responding to the world. And those constructs, a bit like the unconscious biases I mentioned before, are very much informed by our development and our upbringing and the systems, not formal systems, but kind of the environments around us. If anyone knows Bronfenbrenner's ecosystemic theory, that word ecosystems in there is a bit of a nod to that. It's a beautiful psychological theory about how an individual is shaped by so much, yes, their immediate family and friends, but also their work environment or their school environment, and then also by wider influences such as cultural zeitgeists and government policy. All of these things impact upon an individual's development, and that's that wider environment is very much where these constructs, these values come from in an individual. ECP views, as I've mentioned before, us as being very active in the construction of our world, being like scientists or inquirers, and our behaviour challenges the world to respond to us, and that's how we, as Kelly talked about, construct and construe channels of thought, kind of values and constructs upon which we understand everything that's going on around us. And these constructs, these values that Kelly was talking about, are bipolar in the sense that they have an end and then an opposite end. There's always that dichotomy, because he felt it was impossible to understand what a value was, what a concept means to an individual, until it becomes a construct, until there's an opposite to that value. And just as an example, it's not so much a value, but just a word. If I was to ask all of you in the workshop this afternoon to tell me what the opposite of hard is, then I would get lots of different responses, because some would immediately think the opposite of hard would be soft. Some would think of hard as in challenging and difficult, and so might choose the opposite as being easy or straightforward. And some would think of hard as in quite macho and potentially masculine, bit of bias coming through there as well. And so the opposite might be weak or timid or something like that. One word, lots of different opposites, telling us something about what we understand by that word hard. Now, if you think of that as a value, you can start understanding how the opposites, this bipolar construct, is so important, because we can only really understand what someone means by having a value of hardworking or empathetic, for instance, if we know what they understand to be the opposite of that. And that's really important in personal construct psychology. There's also a different level of awareness that we have about these constructs. There are those that we can put quick labels to. We would be able to verbally describe a value, a construct, to someone else, and others that are we're less aware of, but no less influential. And Kelly talked about these dark areas of our mind where these kind of undetected values, constructs sit and inform our interpretations and our behaviours and our actions. But one of the real roles of psychologists, and potentially anyone who's working in a multidisciplinary context, is bringing these values and constructs to the fore, so we're able to recognise and understand how they're shaping and influencing how we feel and think, and also how other people are feeling and thinking at any moment in time. Why is this important to talk about, particularly in a professional context? It's because, and there's a really nice quote here, I think, from George Soros, that it's a two-way feedback loop, that humans aren't so straightforward as to look at objective facts and base decisions purely on that. There's always a lens in front of the perception that colours their judgment. So they don't base their decisions on the facts of the situation. It's instead of their perception, their interpretation, their constructs, their values about that situation. And then equally, although the constructs that we have impact upon that situation because of the decisions that we take, it then comes back the other way to us, and that situation either reinforces or contradicts what those perceptions and interpretations have been. And so you get that feedback loop, and that's where constructs can and the values we have can become even more ingrained, or sometimes they can be destabilized and challenged, and that's a very unnerving place to be when we have our kind of worldview shaken to the core. Can be really problematic for us. Equally, when we're thinking about people alongside us and working in a multidisciplinary context, the different values that people hold change how we think and feel and behave, and therefore it can lead to differences in the judgments that we might make about the severity of a situation, about the probability of something bad happening or something good happening, or a risk assessment. It can change the order in which we prioritize actions. We might agree as a multidisciplinary team 5 important steps that need to be taken for a child or young person, but which one's most important and which one needs to be done first will relate back to the values, those constructs that we hold. And in fact, whether we even prioritize the case at all obviously relates back to our values. Because of that, whether we see somebody else as being someone we want to collaborate with, whether we think we can effectively collaborate with another, and vice versa, whether they feel that's about us, shaped by our values, shaped by our constructs. And then just expectations around outcomes as well. What we think of what success will look like for a child, young person or a family, whether that success has any real likelihood of occurring, all of that is affected by those values that we hold, and how that's different for the different people who are sitting around a table for a case. So what I'm going to do now, if you'll go with me on a bit of an adventure, is just do an exercise which allows us to unpick some of our values. I've tried to think about this carefully and do something that's meaningful with you, but equally not something that's going to cause long-term consternation, because that's unfair in this very snapshotty session. So back to the piece of paper. Clearly I can't see at all whether you're engaging with this or not, so please feel free to sit back and relax and not join in, or join in as you so wish. But if you would like to do a bit of personal value, personal construct exploration, this is it. What I'm going to do now is give you 60 seconds to draw a picture of an individual who you would want to be at a multi-agency meeting. And I don't mean like a celebrity or someone, it's not fancy dinner party stuff. It's when you're thinking of somebody who you feel is a positive presence at a multi-agency meeting. What do they look like? 60 seconds to do a quick drawing, no Picasso's necessary, and then we'll move on to the next step. And that's your lot. As I say, don't worry, we're not doing an art display, so it doesn't matter how it's turned out. It's just giving us a leaping off point for this exercise, which is when you look at that fictional individual, what comes to mind about them as a person? Tell me 3 things about them. I don't want to say too much more than that, because the whole point is it's not meant to be leading, but essentially tell me 3 characteristics, 3 bits of information about that person who's a really good presence in a multi-agency meeting. I'll give you 30 seconds for that. Now, tell me on the piece of paper 3 opposites to those 3 things you've written down. So as a deliberately silly example, if for some reason you've told me that they've got blonde hair, if you've gone for physical characteristics rather than kind of mental emotional ones, the opposite of blonde might be brunette, for instance, and so that would be it. So you should have 3 things that you've told me about the person, and now I want the 3 opposites to those things. Again, 30 seconds just to do that. That's 30 seconds by my watch. So what you'll hopefully have now are 3 bipolar constructs. You've told me 3 things about an individual, and you've got the opposites to those. They are your bipolar constructs. And what's brilliant about personal construct psychology is that those constructs, those values you've generated, will be different from other people who've been doing this exercise in the workshop. So even though we've talked about something that we probably feel we would all pretty much agree on, which is who do you want, what type of person would you want in a multi-agency meeting, what's really important to us, our deep-seated personal values, come through in an exercise like this. So if you would like to, and by no means it's compulsory, but it is anonymous, so don't worry about being identified in any way. I'd like you to share your bipolar constructs, and to do that, I've got a bit of hopeful technical wizardry using Mentimeter. So I'll pop the link just in the chat if anyone's using it by that. But if not, let me stop sharing that screen and start sharing my Mentimeter screen. What it is a website where you can effectively text in your results, a bit like a fancy TV program or something. So Blue Peter again, here's one I prepared earlier. This is the same screen that I used with the previous session, so you can see the type of constructs that people were able to text in at that point. If you're not familiar with this, on your phone or your laptop or whatever you're on, go to menti.com, and then it'll ask for an 8-digit code, and that's on the screen in front of you. But also you can just click the hyperlink in the chat bar and then fill in as a result. You can see how, and I'm sure some more will come in from this group in just a moment, there are lots of different bipolar constructs, our values around us, that we can that tell us what's important. And this is, I guess, the crucial part of why we're talking through this. The aim of this is not really to understand about how what makes a good multi-agency worker. It's to see what values are important to you. What do you hold dear? So, for instance, the person who's written compassionate versus uncaring in the yellow box on the left-hand side, or in the middle, warm versus cold. Those people have got values that relate to empathy and to emotional warmth, whereas there's another one that I saw earlier about action versus inaction there, bottom in the middle column. That's a value that's obviously far more action orientated. Is someone a dynamic individual who gets stuff done or not? So you can start to see how the same situation has helped us to elicit different personal values that we hold. And I stressed that there were no, and Kelly, not just me, but the people who developed personal construct psychology wanted everybody to recognize there's no such thing as a wrong value to hold. These are personal constructs that we have, but it's understanding what they mean to us and why they're important in how they shape our behavior. That's where the real value comes from. We're not making judgments about these values. Thank you so much for those who are putting stuff in. That's great. What I'm going to do, because I'm just mindful of the time, I'll keep that running in the background and return to it at the very end. So if you are texting in, please keep doing so. But in the meantime, I'm just going to stop sharing that and jump back to our presentation for the last few slides. The exercise we've just done is a loose form of what's called a repertory grid. I've kind of mangled it quite deliberately in order to make it work for our workshop today. But if you're interested in exploring other people's values, you can do so using quite formal techniques. And the most common of those is a repertory grid, where you have different elements and you effectively create these constructs, develop these constructs by asking people how element A contrasts with elements B and C. So to choose something dear to my heart, if you wanted to think about the constructs that people had around football players, I might ask you, how does Harry Kane contrast with Raheem Sterling and Jadon Sancho? And that might mean nothing to you, but if it does mean something to you, you'd be able to start saying, oh, well, Kane is more hardworking than the other two. Or you might say, well, Raheem Sterling's more potent in his goal scoring than the other two. That starts to elicit your constructs, and that's what you go through that exercise again and again, all the time, using these triads, exploring how is one thing different from the other two, and that can elicit constructs. But in the context of me talking to you today about multidisciplinary working and all the safeguarding work around ACEs, it's unlikely and probably not desirable to use such a formal method to explore other people's constructs and values. So instead, you're going to have to use more covert, subtle methods if you're looking to understand where people are coming from, what people's values are. One thing you can do is listen out for clues and cues in what people are saying. If a situation is being discussed in a meeting and someone makes a judgment or an assumption about that situation, particularly if it's one that stands out to you because it's not the same assumption you'd have made, that starts to give you an indication that there might be a value there that's potentially worth exploring. So for instance, an example I gave in the last session, school avoidance. If you're talking about a young person who's not attending a school and somebody else in the meeting starts suggesting that we need to find ways to get them academically engaged in the curriculum again, that's already suggesting a bit of a value judgment around why do people go to school? What's important about childhood and school and success? Because to other people, not attending school might be around friendship issues or anxieties provoked by the school environment, lots of different things. So that's where we might start to pick upon other people's values. Equally, observing reactions to some of that information being shared. If someone kind of pulls a bit of a face, so to speak, when information is being shared, that might give you a bit of a clue that what has been shared and discussed is at odds with a value they hold, or is very much in agreement with a value that they hold. And equally, it's a bit hard to do, but asking those questions, being a bit more explicit about it and saying, I wonder what the situation facing this child can tell us about his or her situation. You'll get just like the exercise we've done around the multidisciplinary working just now, you'll get different responses to that, and that can help you understand the different values that people hold. Now, I emphasize that there isn't there is no value judgment on values, on constructs. That's the joy of them. There's not a right or wrong. So why I'm interested in raising awareness of them this afternoon is because they impact upon how we work together. Because and Andy made a really great point in the last session, you can have very well-meaning, well-intentioned values from different organisations, from a local authority, from the NHS, from police, but they're all subtly different, which means they're all pulling in slightly different directions, and that lessens the effectiveness of the work that we're doing around a family or a child or young person. And that's why they're of interest to us, because if we can bring those implicit personal constructs and values to the fore and discuss them as a group of collaborating professionals, will be more effective as a result. So if you think that you have picked up that someone's got a similar construct to you or a different construct to you from how they've spoken or how they've reacted in a meeting, just be reflective yourself. Think about whether it is something that you agree with or it contrasts with a value. It's you're a very emotionally focused person, your values are around emotions, and they've chosen something very practical. How does that make you feel? How does that value that they hold impact upon their behavior? And how might that value that they hold then impact on your behavior? And as a result, does all of that need further discussion? Is it an elephant in the room that if you call it out in a constructive fashion and have a discussion about how your values are aligned with their values or are different from their values, you can then work much more effectively in a multidisciplinary environment because you're all pulling, as I've said before, in the same direction. Right, we've got a bit of time right to the end for discussion before we head off to the last session of the day. Some potential discussion questions there I'm going to flash up, but people I'm sure will have questions, their own thoughts. So let me take those down and see if anyone wants to come in at this point. Jodie's asked about is the work that could be done with teenagers. So there's a book by a gentleman called Rick Beaver that has a lot of practical activities for exploring people's constructs, and in fact the one that I did with you this afternoon about drawing an individual and then telling things about them is kind of very much riffed off something that he believes in. I think that's a great starting point, even for the most standoffish children, young people. Generally, when I'm working in schools, I find that drawing is a great icebreaker, because even if an individual won't really speak to you or isn't feeling in that place, they don't mind drawing, and so that gets the conversations underway. And then because they can obviously verbally tell you the three things about that individual, but they don't have to. They could also write them down, and it just means if engaging in a verbal way is a bit of a block, it gives you alternatives. The example I did was obviously drawing a person, and so if the issue at school is that an individual has been heavily bullied, then you might choose to explore it by drawing a picture of somebody that's not bullied at all, for instance. And then what are the three things about that person who doesn't get bullied, and what are those values, exploring those constructs, just as an example. But equally, it doesn't need to be a person, could also be a thing. So back to my favorite topic of school avoidance, just because it's so big at the moment, so I don't know what it's like in your worlds. But you could get them to draw a picture of a school that they would absolutely love to go to. Now tell me three things about that ideal school. What are the three things that are opposite to those things? And we're starting to see what really means something to that child. George Kelly, when developing personal construct psychology, spoke about self-characterization, a really important idea that people should be trusted to talk about their own constructs and reveal them to others more than we often do. So let people share their own narrative, trust that they will tell us some of the things that really matter to them. So that's just an idea. Just while you have a think, I'm going to pop that Mentimeter screen back up, as I said I would. And it should scroll through some of the other ideas. I've still got Teams up if anyone does want to jump in. Open-minded versus closed-minded. That's nice. Fun versus boring. That's a fascinating one. Why, that's the psychologist in me wanting to jump in about what that value means to you. There's a technique called laddering. If you really get into personal construct psychology, and what you want to do is progressively explore what are called superordinate constructs. So you ask, well, what, why is that? Why is being fun? You start off by saying, right, the fun versus boring construct. Which end would you like to be on? That's a bit of a loaded question for that one, but for others it's sometimes harder to know, and they answer fun. And you go, oh, so what is it about being fun that's important to you? And that elicits another construct and another construct, and you keep going until you get what's most important. And they can sometimes, we talked about levels of awareness, that's some of the stuff that sits deepest within our personality, within our individuals, that we can tap into like that. Great stuff. Thank you so much for engaging with this. Right, I've just seen the clock tick over into 3 o'clock, so I shall bid you all farewell. Thank you so much for your engagement. Thanks for taking part in the activity. I hope you learned something from this session, and see you in the next one. Thanks very much.